and pick up where we left off the other day and where we left off yesterday, talking about the relationship of ancient Kemetic people with other places in Africa and places, farther south of them. So I want to kind of pick up and talk about that. I hope that you are doing well as it kind of minimize some things to get started. We talk a lot about ancient Kemet, and we talk a lot about the area with respect to Punt. And a lot of times people, as I mentioned yesterday when I was talking about this whole idea about the relationship of Kemet to its neighbors in the south and various places, Nubian people, that a lot of times people like to paint a broad brush with respect to how ancient Kemetic people interacted with the people who were farther south of them. And that's just not the case. These were different people. These were people who had societies, and there were different relationships that Kemetic people had with people who were their neighbors to the south. Just like they had various relationships and types of relationships with people who might have been to the north of them, if you will. So as I start to talk, we're going to kind of jump into one of the more famous areas of ancient Kemet and one of the most famous depictions of what the land of Punt was like, and how we know about the relationships with the Kemetic people with respect to the land of Punt. And there's a lot that took place in the temple in the southern part of ancient Kemet, near what's called Auset, in the temple that is Hatshepsut. And when you look at this temple, this is an amazing mortuary temple. It's a temple that she had built that was in honor of God Amen. It's in honor of Amen, and it was going to be a place where mortuary sacrifices and offerings could be made on her behalf, as well as the behalf of her father, and then eventually also Thutmose III. There was a number of things that was going to be used in this particular mortuary temple. But in this temple, they talked a lot about, she had documented on the walls of this temple an expedition, her famous expedition to Punt. So we're going to talk about that and walk through some of that and what that meant today as we talk about the land of Punt. And I want to thank all of you for joining, and please feel free to put your comments down below, some of the things that you're thinking about. Feel free to share it, and let's kind of go in, because we're going to kind of jump into this and go through a lot of information today. We're going to walk through a lot of information today as we go through this. And I want to kind of start out by just talking about Hatshepsut and giving some background with respect to him. Giving some background with Punt, because one of the main ideas and one of the main themes I want to get across today is that not everybody who was in a southern neighbor of ancient Kemet was treated in the way people like to show on TV or online. They show you these sandals of Tutankhamun, and they show you people being stomped under the feet of Kemetic people, and they show you something from Ramses II in one of his temples that he made, where he's grabbing somebody by the hair, or he has somebody tied up. And they try to say, this is how Kemetic people treated Nubians. And in saying that, they're trying to say, this is how Kemetic people treated black people, as if Kemetic people were not black, or there were not black people amongst Kemetic people, and that this is how they treated everybody to the south. And that's a very broad, stereotypical, wrong, and racist way of looking at the people and the societies that were there, to say that, something that was depicted in Abu Simbel represented how they interacted with all black people and what black people were doing. And that's just not right. And when you look at the archaeological evidence and the evidence that they left a lot more nuances and a lot more specifics in terms of how they dealt with people. And we saw yesterday how there was some interaction between Twa people and people who were, shorter people who were, of the Central African origin, who were interacting with people in the Old Kingdom, King Pepi II and Assisi and various people like that, with respect to doing the God's dances. Well, that was another example of Kemetic people having respect for people who came from the south for them, and also getting a lot of their resources that they used in their temples and in their mortuary temples and in their offerings with respect to that, getting those things from Central Africa. So as we kind of go into that and kind of bridge into that, we're seeing right here, we're going to look at the temple of Hatshepsut. And Hatshepsut reigned from about 1479 BC to about 1458 BC. And she was the daughter of Thutmose I. And you look at her mortuary temple, and it's the one that's on top. It's the huge one right there. Beneath it is Mentuhotep II. And Mentuhotep II, as you probably know, was the founder of the Middle Kingdom, if you will. So he was the person who was founded with joining the two lands during the Middle Kingdom, before the New Kingdom started. So he was a remarkable person. Hatshepsut kind of following in his footsteps, because his temple itself that's down there on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen was a remarkable temple with a pyramid on top of that square symbol that you see, and the ramp going up. Well, Hatshepsut had her temple built right next to his. And so it's a remarkable type of thing. And she has her temple built right next to his. It's kind of on a west-east axis, if you will. So the left side of the temple that's right there, right up against the rocks and the cliffs, you go, that's the west. if you will. And then you kind of go all the way out where you see the ramps are, that's facing east. And so then the part that's kind of towards the bottom, that left-hand side, if you will, towards the bottom is the south of the temple. And then the other side that's on the top of it is the north side of the temple. And why that's significant, because it gives you some very specific things in terms of how they oriented their temples, why they did it on the east-west axis. Obviously, when you deal with the rising of the sun and the setting of the sun from a mortuary standpoint, that being very significant. And they did specific things with respect to the expedition to Punt that talked about direction. And it's one of the reasons, and it's not just her expedition that she did to Punt, but it's one of the reasons, as well as long as many other things, or well with many other things, that let us know that Punt was to the south of them. So we're going to talk about that and kind of walk through some resources today as we go through it. And I thank you so much for joining, and please put your comments down below. I'm going to walk through a resource here that talks about punts in God's land. And if you are a member, one of the paid members here on YouTube, I thank you so much. God bless you. Thank you for working with me and supporting with me. I very much appreciate it. It's $4.99 a month at the history class level. And if you want to go higher than that, it's $9.99 a month. But I appreciate those who are supporting. You have access to this resource. You just go on our member kind of site, if you will, as well as our post, and I put the part of my website that has this, as well as the passcode to get into it if you're a member. So I very much appreciate you have access to this and you can download it. But I'm going to talk through this a little bit today and kind of walk through this resource, because as we look at an example and look at Hatshepsut and take a look at the land of Punt, I want to walk through what did she actually say on the walls. If you look at the walls of her mortuary temple and you think about what's on these walls, what did she actually say? Like, what was she actually talking about when she talked about this trip that she organized to ancient to Punt? And we think about it, her entire temple, it was all dedicated to Amen. So as you probably are aware, in ancient Kemet, especially during the New Kingdom, which is where Hatshepsut, when she ruled, was during the New Kingdom. So she is of the line of Thutmose I and Ahmose, who helped us found the New Kingdom, as well as, she comes before Tutankhamun and before Akhenaten. She's in that whole very famous, probably the most famous dynasty of ancient Kemet is the 18th dynasty. And she's in that dynasty, and she is there. And she is talking about Amen. And Amen becomes the premium, if you will, expression of God that's venerated. And we've talked about this with respect to Neterology, how they had an idea of God being expressed in many forms. They had an idea of a supreme being, and that being expressed in many forms. And they venerated Amen in this temple and in Auset during the time of Hatshepsut. So in particular, during her time, when we're talking about, the 1400s BC and the New Kingdom, they are venerating Amen. And this temple that Hatshepsut builds, she builds it in honor of Amen. She builds it to be able to do mortuary things to him. You see right up top, it's a massive temple. You see there are terraces there. There are ramps that lead up to the terrace. And one of those ramps lead to an area where there's an entire mural that talks about her expedition to Punt. And her idea, she says that she was given this demand and this command, if you will, from Amen, from God, to tell her to go build God's land in Kemet. Her idea was to take parts of the land of Punt, which was God's land, the divine land, and the land of our ancestors, and to build that in Kemet, in this mortuary temple that you see right there. So she wanted to go to ancient Kemet. In ancient Kemet, she wanted to go to Punt to get aspects of Punt, mortuaries and things from Punt, and to bring it back into Kemet and to put it in her temple, and to make her offerings that she would be given to Amen in her honor and honor of her father and various things like that, to make them the best that they could be, to be able to give God her best. And so this was an entire initiative that she undertook, and she talked about people doing it before her, but her doing it the best, if you will. And it becomes the most famous expedition to Punt, and it becomes one of the primary sources of what we know about ancient Punt is from the murals and the depictions on her wall and her walls and the documents that she left. So I want to talk about that, because Punt becomes a very special place, and there becomes this narrative that's out there that's in the internet and in some popular thoughts, when people try to make like this hateful relationship that Kemet had with people to its south. And you just don't see that in all these instances. And it's like painting a broad brush for everybody, looking at everybody there and saying, because they fought some people, and because they had some periods of trade, some periods of peace, and some periods of war, where they spoke bombastically about a lot of things, that they must have hated everybody, and hated everybody who they think are black, who they call black, that was to the south of Kemet. And that was just not the case. And I wanted to share a couple things with you, because as I look at this incredible temple here, and as she documents what's taking place in her temple, there are some archaeologists who talked a lot about what was found in this temple and what people thought about in terms of ancient Kemet. And I want to share this right here. And this is coming from this particular a short history of the Egyptian people. I want to read this for you. If you look at the very top there, and I'll show you again the reference for it if you want to take a look at it. This is from Wallis Budge, who is a very famous Egyptologist from back in the day, literally Egyptologist. He says at the very top, Egyptian tradition in the dynastic period held that the aboriginal home of the Egyptians was Punt. And though our information about the boundaries of this land is of the vaguest character, it is quite certain that it had a very large proportion of it was in Central Africa. And it probably was near the country in terms of what we call today Uganda. If you stop and think about it, he's saying right there in this short history of Egyptian people that the Egyptian tradition in the dynastic period held that the aboriginal home of the Egyptians was Punt. If you look there right at the top of the page there, that's what he's saying. Now, this is Wallis Budge making this comment, back in the early 1900s. And you start to think and say, hold on, wait a minute for a second. Here we have an archaeologist, a very famous, probably the most famous or one of the most famous archaeologists in history, and certainly of Egyptology, if you will, saying that the ancestral homeland of the Kemetic people, according to them, according to the dynastic period, was the land of Punt, that they held that their home of the aboriginal home of the Egyptians was Punt. And you start to think about that. Wow, right? When you start to step back from that, and I ask myself the question, a couple of different ways. For people who say, hey, that they don't like it when certain people talk about Punt, or when Black people or African Americans talk about Punt, it's not your culture. I say, well, if it is your culture, if you're looking at what the Kemetic people said, then you must also be related to the people of Punt. You must also identify with this area of Africa, because that's where the ancient Kemetic people said they were from. And then also, from that perspective, who talks about that? Why don't we put that up front? When people talk about ancient Kemet and its relationship with people to the south, a lot of times when they say that, they don't mention in the same breath that they also said that they were from the land of Punt. And this is, like I said, not just me saying it. These are Egyptologists long ago acknowledging that and putting it out in the forefront before it stopped being acknowledged. Because you say that this is somehow not connected with people to the south. That's not what they said. That's not what they put in their temples. That's not what they put in their documents. You don't find them going, to other places around the world. They're not going to some far off place. They're going to the land of Punt to bring back God's land and to put it in Kemet. That's what this whole temple was dedicated to. And the whole process of the offerings that Hatshepsut was putting in her temple was to go get God's land and to bring it and to put it in Kemet. And so when you think about that, a lot of people just never deal with that. And I think God bless you. God bless you. It was right. You're right, Marby. It was next to Mentuhotep II. You can see that very much. Land of Punt in modern Eritrea. So we know a little bit more about it now, but we have, additional things that we still need to find out, more things that we want to find out. But stop and think with it. This effort that was made, and we're going to talk about the effort that was to take all of this Kemetic information, to take all of this information and to really walk by and start to bring back the land of Punt and to bring it in Kemet. It gives you an idea and gives you an honest idea that the Kemetic people saw the land of Punt as being a place of significance, that this was a place where God dwelled, where even the gods of gods, even the company of gods, the expressions of God dwelled in the land of Punt. And you'll see as we talk about her depictions that were actually on the wall, what she said, what they documented on the wall. They talk about it that Hathor being the mistress of Punt, that this being the land where they're bringing forth gifts from God in order to be able to serve God more fully. This is a very interesting thing. And as we talk about this, the other thing that you'll notice is that as they interact with the people from the land of Punt during this expedition, and these are soldiers from the wall of Hatshepsut's temple, by the way, when they talk about their interactions with the people from the land of Punt, they never talk about or indicate that they had a difficult time speaking with them. They never talk about or indicate that there was some problems with communication, but you see they're living pretty far apart. How are they interacting with these people and knowing how to talk with one another if they're not having a commonality and relationships and trade and some type of connection that's going on for a long period of time? And they say it's the connection of ancestorship and a connection of trade and many things that they're doing religiously. So as we get into that, and kind of jump into ancient Kemet. I want to talk a little about this Punt and God's land and kind of jump into a couple of things. Because one of the things I want to mention as we think about this is you think about where Punt was and how things are kind of situated. As we look at that, you'll notice obviously that, Upper Kemet is the southern part of ancient Kemet. And as you start to go farther and farther south, you're getting into Nubia, Upper Nubia. And as you go farther and farther that, we know that ancient Punt was to the south, and we know that it was going out toward the east and probably along a coast, given the way they talked about the boats and how they set up harbor and how they set up port. So we're going far south in Africa, and we're going towards the sea, perhaps towards the coast of the Red Sea. And I know a lot of people will say Eritrea, some people say Somalia, but we know it's toward the coast of the Red Sea, giving all the specifics in the documentation. And I'd love to hear people, add to the comments below. Please. I think, the land all is east, Southern Africa, right? Tanzania, Swahili coast, very good point there. There's a lot that's going on in Eastern Africa. So as we talk about that, I want to also let you know, as the ancient Kemetic people talked about themselves being from the land of Punt, I just told you and showed you that Wallis Budge making that appointment and making that point. As you looked at the land of Nubia, they oriented themselves from a Kemetic perspective to the south. So a lot of times, they're looking toward the land of their ancestors. They're orienting themselves to the south. And obviously, as you go farther south, you're getting higher and higher up, but they oriented themselves to the south. So a lot of times we will look at Kemet from a standpoint of, we're looking at north at the top and south being on the bottom from a map standpoint. But they had the opposite, the exact opposite way of looking at the world. So a lot of times you will see them kind of referred to, or north will kind of be behind them, and the upper part going toward the source of the Nile, going toward the land of their ancestors, that being in front of them. So that south is kind of being in front of them. They oriented themselves in a slightly different way with respect to north and south. So if you just kind of flip the world upside down, you'll begin to see maybe this is how they looked at the world in a slightly different way than the way we looked at it today. We look at it today. So as I look at that, and we kind of jump into this and kind of say, what are they talking about as they go, where they're going and how they're going up and down the Nile? And as I mentioned, a lot of it comes right from going to center around her temple and center around what she put in the walls of her temple. And just to give you like another perspective, so that's her temple up top, and you look at one of the terraces, one of the ramps that lead up to the terrace, and you can see the whole back wall, the west side of the wall, which is kind of facing the cliffs, the south side of the wall, which is kind of facing toward Mentuhotep II's his mortuary temple there, and the north side of it facing towards the northern end, towards the top of the picture wheel. That's kind of how her temple was oriented as we talk through what was taking place in her temple. So let's talk about it. Let's read through. Let's talk about what she says happened in her temple. And you can see there are magnificent things that she put. It's a beautiful temple. It's literally carved right into the rocks there. And her dedication was to make sure the God Amen got the best offerings and got the best from her, and that she listened to God's calling for her life. Like that's what she puts. And I'm gonna take a word for it, right? This is what she said she was doing it for, to listen to God's calling for her life and to give God the best that she had to give him. And so as we talk about this, as we look at these rock cut temples, and then before I go into a couple, I want to make another note, because it wasn't just Wallis Budge who noted that the ancient Kemetic people during the dynastic period said that their ancestors came from Punt. I want to quote another person here, and I'm quoting right from this book, if you will, Manship White. I'm quoting right from this book right here that you can see, that you can take a look at. He says right here on page 141, it may be noted that the ancient Egyptians themselves appear to have been convinced that their place of origin was African rather than Asian. This is very interesting. Appear to have been convinced, like they didn't know where they were from. They made continued reference to the land of Punt as their homeland. So here is J.E. Manship White right here in this book right here, talking about the Kemetic people making continued reference to the land of Punt as their homeland. So right there, when people start to say that somehow Kemetic people were separated from the people who were in Africa, who were farther south, that does not fly in the face of history. It doesn't fly in the face of what they said about themselves. Why wouldn't they know where they're from? Why wouldn't they know what was significant to them? And it also says you that there had to be a significant Black African population, African Black population amongst the Kemetic people, although people want to, say otherwise, because this is what they're saying. this is what they're talking about. And perhaps our ideas about race and the racist way we look at things are not the same way. And it's not the same way that people looked at it back in the day. And I have no problem and no doubt that there were people from various parts of the world. It's completely okay who were, in today's Libya and from eventually we talked about earlier how Greek people came into ancient Kemetic borders, how people from the Levant and what we call the Middle East, that there were many things happening, but there were Africans and Black Africans, and the society that became Kemet was an indigenous society. There was nobody who came, from some remarkable place and just immediately started the country of Kemet, and it came out of nowhere. These were people who had been living there for thousands of years, who developed this culture and had a mix of things happening with them. But they themselves said, according to a lot of historians and archaeologists and themselves, that their homeland was the land of Punt. That's what they said. So this idea that they must have hated the people to the south, this idea that they show you pictures of them interacting with Nubian people during times of war and say that characterizes their entire relationship with people, Black people who are in the south, it's just not true. It just doesn't fly when we look at the actual evidence. So as we start to look at this and dig a little deeper, I want to kind of go into, so not only did they say it was the ancestral homeland, I want to kind of go into as we talk about it. And as someone is mentioning down in the comments, Eritrea and this whole area of Africa, as you go farther south in Kemet and go into what is Nubia, what will become Nubia and Kush, and kind of go out toward the Red Sea. These are the descriptions that Kemetic people talked about in terms of when they went to Punt. So whether you're looking at people in the 5th dynasty, and I mentioned King Sahura did a expedition to Punt during the 5th dynasty. When you go in the Middle Kingdom, you can see people in the 11th dynasty and the 12th dynasty also making expeditions to Punt. And they talk about going on, riverbeds that are probably now since dried out and making their way toward the sea and selling south. And you hear specifically, even more specifically, which we're about to talk about in Hatshepsut's account, how they traveled south to go toward the land of Punt. So as we put in there, and I'm sure there are people who have other references and many things you can share. God bless you. Peace to you as well, Marby. Yes, peace, my brother. God bless you. That there are other things that you can share, that you can tell people about this. So as we look at this, so we start to kind of, let's examine what they talked about. So what was she saying? And as you start to look at, the depictions from the people of the land of Punt and what was taking place on her wall. So if you, as I kind of showed you before, and I kind of pull up this whole diagram right here, gives you an idea of what was written on her wall. You can see that very far, the longest part of the wall, which is kind of facing west, as I kind of give you another view of it, that longest part of the wall, which is right facing toward the cliff, that's facing west right there. And the ones that's closer to Mentuhotep II's temple is the southern part. That's the southern part. On the other side is obviously the north. As we look at that, she depicts on that whole terrace area, that whole floor, if you will, that whole area, what the expedition to Punt was about, how they went there successfully, how they got back, what they brought back. All of that is depicted on the walls of her temple there. And you have depictions of people setting out on the boat. And it's very interesting when you see the depictions of the people setting out on the boat, and it even goes through this, just as James breasted right here, his diagram of this. It even talks about the departure and how during the departure of the trip going toward Punt, how the front of the boat, the parts of the boat that would be going front were headed south. The boats that went were headed south. So they specifically show themselves pointing in the southern direction, as well as when you travel in the south with respect to ancient Kemet, you are traveling like against the current, because the current is flowing from the south to the north. So as you are going south, you're going to have to travel against the current, but you also have the wind at your back. So the wind is helping you. So you would obviously put up sails when you were traveling south, because the wind would help you because you're going against the current. And they do all that specific things in their depiction of traveling south when they're going towards Punt. When you're coming back north, you could put your sails down a bit because you were traveling with the current, and you would be able to flow much more easily when you're traveling with the current, even though the wind might be in your face. And so the sails might not help you as much because to be going against the way you want to go when you're traveling north. So when you start to see this, you start to see that the Kemetic people showed specifically that they were traveling south when they were going to go visit Punt, specifically on the walls of Hatshepsut and in other cases as well. So as she's depicting where they're going and how they're traveling south, there's a number of things they're talking about. And so they talk about, the boat setting out, and you can see images of the boat. And I want to show you that like here, so you can kind of see images of the boat and kind of get a little bit of a look at it. So this is kind of a little hard to see, but you can kind of see just the kind of the outlines of the images of the boats that were depicted on her walls in her sanctuary in the southern part of what was Kemet and Auset. And you can see those depictions there, the people kind of headed out to go visit ancient Punt. And there's right there on her wall, she's showing exactly what they're talking about in terms of where they're going. So as we move forward and kind of talk more about that, God bless you. Greetings. How you doing, Donnie Williams? God bless you. Pan-African Designs and Apparel. God bless you. I'd love to see what you have going on. That'd be interesting. I'd love to see what you have going on, Pan-African Designs. God bless you. Donnie Williams, God bless you. Thank you so much for joining. So as we kind of get back here and talk about this, so they're talking about the boats, and in the depiction on the walls, they're talking about that they're sailing. So they're sailing and they're beginning the goodly trip, if you were, toward God's land, that they're journeying in peace to the land of Punt. And it talks about how they're doing it for the God Amen, and that he is the presider over Hatshepsut, and that he's doing it, and that Hatshepsut has been the person who's telling them to go. So they're documenting all of this on her walls, how they're doing this for God, and they're going out to God's land, to the ancient land of Punt. And they set it out and they show you. And as I mentioned, it's all document on the walls, as we just showed, on the west side and the southern side in terms of where they're going out, and the northern side of the wall, her temple walls. And then they begin to talk about the rulers of Kemet and how they show and depict them arriving in God's land, and that they get there with the army behind them. So they're coming to the land of Punt, and they have the Kemetic soldiers behind them, and they're going to be greeted by the rulers of Punt, the king and queen of Punt. And it's amazing because you can see, as they take their trip out, you can see this is a depiction right here of the wife of the king of Punt. So she would be the queen of Punt, and this is her husband. So this is Queen Eti and Peru. And these are the people, these are depicted on the walls of ancient Kemet. And I'll even move myself because I feel like this is kind of a great honor just to share, just so you can get a better description and seeing of them. You can see she's a woman who has a lot of the descriptive things that they talk about with respect to some parts of Africa, where you're seen as being, in some parts, where you're seen as being wealthy and being healthy and of great wealth, if you will, and great importance if you're a little overweight, if you have a lot of weight on you, because that says that you have enough to be able to consume and to indulge and take part in wealth, if you will. So, but they specifically show her and their children behind them, as well as him and the leader, if you will, in front of them. So you're literally looking at history. You're literally looking at a king and a queen of Punt as you look at this, which I think is an amazing thing. And for them to have depicted this on the wall, there you go. Pray to themselves. God bless you, Regmar. Thank you very much. Yes, Reg Marby, I see that, painted themselves in a specific way. So you're literally looking at a queen and a king of ancient Punt right here on the walls depicted at Hatshepsut temple. And it's an amazing thing because all of this, as I mentioned, is depicted right on her walls, and she's documenting in stone. It's amazing that they documented things in stone. I believe there's a lot of things that happen all around the world and in Africa that were used in mud brick, or that were used that use materials that are somehow biodegraded and that are lost. There are a lot of things in history that have been lost that we'll never know, and maybe someone will find out. I mean, even the people who discovered Nabta Playa years ago said that for a time they had walked right by and didn't know what they were walking over. They didn't know that this was actually a site until they really stopped and kind of almost found it by accident and figured, wait a minute, these stones are positioned in a way that they look like they were put here on purpose. There were a lot of things that are looked over from an archaeological perspective that we either don't look for or we haven't seen. And it's amazing that the Kemetic people did so much in stone. And to me, it doesn't mean that other people didn't do things. It doesn't mean that other people didn't do things in stone or do things in other mediums and other formats, if you will, that have now been lost. So I just wanted to point that out there. So they talk about on the walls of her temple that they reached the land of Punt, that they reached the great ones of Punt, and that they're receiving the king's army. And as they're doing it, they're talking about all the different things that they're receiving when they go to Punt. They talk about being able to interact with them, and that Queen Eti and Peru asked them, by which way did you come? Because basically they're saying it's been a while since the people from Kemet have come to us. It's almost like you guys don't know the way. It's like, how did you get here from the standpoint of your people not knowing how to get here. It's been a long time. And they talk about, how did you get there? Where did you come from? And the army and the leaders of Hatshepsut's exhibition, if you will, and expedition say, we've come from our land, and we've come on behalf of Hatshepsut and Ma Kare, because she had several throne names. She's the king of Upper and Lower Kemet. And they talk about how they want to, praise her. Obviously, the Kemetic people are going to talk about the Puntite people praising her and being very respectful to Hatshepsut. And that, we come and they bring gifts. They bring resources from ancient Kemet, beer and barley and things of that, and they give it to the people of Punt. And in exchange, the people of Punt give them resources. They give them mortuaries. They give them ebony. They give them panther skins. They give them all kinds of incense. They give them apes. They give them dogs. They give them various things that Kemetic people would use, and Hatshepsut wanted to use in her mortuary temple, in her offerings to Amen. So a lot of these resources were religious resources that they're giving them. And the interesting thing about it, as I mentioned before, they make no indication that they could not talk. Like, so imagine if they came all the way to Punt, and they traveled all this way, all the way down, through Upper Kemet, all the way down toward the Red Sea, farther south in Africa, and they couldn't talk to anybody. How did they talk to one another? Was there a translator being used? They make no indication of there being any problem with them being able to communicate. It says to me they had something in common, right? If you can talk to people who live a long way away from you, that means you've talked to them before, or you have a common language, or something's going on with connections in that area that you guys can speak. Or there would only have to be one person, right, who could talk to them, and maybe they had one person who could talk, but they didn't know they were coming. So there had to be something, some kind of way there was a connection, in some kind of way they were able to communicate, and they were able to trade these goods one to another. And they did not indicate in any way that they had difficulty talking with one another, or that this was a strange land and a strange place. They were just surprised to see him and said, it's been a long time, and we don't even think your people knew the way. There must have still been a connection there. And the interesting thing apart about it, as we think about this, we look at, and you can see right here depictions of the soldiers on the wall, and I want to kind of show you that so you can see that up close. You can see pictures of soldiers in the army that she sent, and examples of the people who were in the Kemetic army at this time when Hatshepsut was in charge. When she was ruling the nation, this is what the Kemetic army looked like. A lot of people want to say a lot of things, but the Kemetic army had a lot of people in them. And for a long period of time, Kemetic people had a lot of Nubian people in their army. There was mixing and mixturing, and we're talking Nubia in terms of ethnicity and culture, right? Not just in terms of necessarily color, really. We're talking about culture. And you could have had people who mixed and shared and didn't have the same kind of problems that we have with color that we have today, but that worked together and interacted together. So you're talking more about distinctions, minor distinctions, and cultural things and societal things than you're necessarily talking about complete heritage. They could have had the same heritage or a shared heritage and still had distinct societies at this time. But there were a number of Nubian people who served, as you probably know, in the Kemetic army in the New Kingdom, in the Middle Kingdom with Ptahhotep II, and in the Old Kingdom. As far back as you can look, you can find indications of, and we'll talk about that again more than likely in the autobiography of Winnie, of significant numbers of Nubian men in Kemetic armies. And you can see just depictions of various things and Nubian-like depictions as we go through some of the other things that show Nubian people in the Kemetic army. So as you start to look at that, you see that it's an amazing army. And notice that they're not wearing shoes. And I always thought this interesting, and I'd like to see what you think about this. One of the things that kind of jumps out at me, that people who don't want to say, hey, God bless you, thank you very much, for people who don't want to say that there were people of color in ancient Kemet, because I think we had room for everybody at the seat of humanity. At the human table and the human family has room for everybody. There's no reason to exclude people. For people who want to say that there weren't people of color and a part of the Kemetic society, how is it that people live in a desert for thousands of years, literally tens of thousands of years? They show you what they're wearing. They're not wearing very many clothes. They're walking around with no shoes. How are they not dark? How are they not people of color? Like, that doesn't even make sense, right? You really see people depict them in ways that don't make sense. If you were from this area, if you're saying that your people come, that your ancestors come from the land of Punt, if you were walking around, exposing your body like a lot of people do in Africa, right? In particular at that time, like a lot of people did in Africa, you're going to find that a lot of people are people of color. I mean, that wouldn't be surprising. And that doesn't mean that there aren't people from other parts of the world in ancient Kemet, but it really seems silly to assume that there aren't people in large numbers and significant ways in every aspect of society interacting with ancient Kemet. And that the people that they interacted who were farther south were not always people that they hated, right? They weren't always people that they were despising. There were people like the land of Punt and like the Twa people that we talked about yesterday, where they interacted with them for religious reasons. And they interacted in ways that were respectful. And they had respect for him, and it wasn't a matter of hate. And they said God came from there. This was God's land. The other thing that lets you know, that talks about with respect to this, just talks about with respect to, and this is Hatshepsut here, that talks about with respect to what the people were like that they came from when they went to ancient Punt and when they came back. An interesting thing they note in her depictions on her wall, an interesting thing they note that when they came back from Punt in the return trip, this is also a lot of things that people don't talk about. One thing that people don't talk about, they brought other people with them. They brought people back. So they brought people who came with the goods that they brought back, and they brought goods from other places south of them. So they talk about there being a southern land that they went to, and they talk about specifically gold from Nubia. They even have a depiction of a Nubian god that was considered to be like a god of wealth and gold, that's on the walls of Hatshepsut's temple, that's there counting the gold with Amen and with Tahuti, that's counting the gold when they count up the gold and the resources that are bringing back from Punt. Because on this expedition to Punt, she didn't just send her to Punt. That was the main reason for going. But when they brought on the way back, they brought back resources from Nubia. They brought back the taxes and the resources that Nubia and Kush was paying to ancient Kemet at that time, because the new kingdom was in control. Hatshepsut was in control of Kush. So they brought back the impost and the taxes from them. They brought back people and resources from at least two other areas that were from the south of them. They brought them with them in addition to people and resources from Punt. So you're clearly talking about how they took a trip south. And they not only went to Punt, they also went to, on the way back, they went to other places and brought those resources with them. And they outline all of this on the walls of her temple, and they talk about it. So as I start to think about it, you start to understand that we know that Punt was from the south. All the indications show that. We know that it was along the sea, and we know that they were interacting with more people than just Punt. So as I kind of jump into her and kind of get back into that and just look at that, it really, makes me understand that as you look at, because you may not be able to convince everybody. And I ask you to look at these things yourself. I mean, read this information for yourself. You can look at the temple of Adel Bahri and Edward Naval, who helped Edward Naval, if you will, who Naval, however you pronounce his name, Naville, who did some of the early expeditions of her temple in Auset, who did some of the early excavations of it. And they have pictures and they talk about it. You can read his account of it. You can go and look at the walls itself and look at interpretations and translations of what took place. And you will find that the idea of African people interacting with Kemetic people was what you would expect it to be. It would be common sense. And I ask you to convince yourself. You may not be able to convince other people, but look at the evidence yourself. They interacted with different people in different ways, much the same way you and I would interact with our neighbors. Sometimes you're going to have good relationships with them. You're going to have very good relationships with your neighbors. And sometimes you're going to have neighbors you may not like. You have neighbors you may fight with, neighbors you may go to war with, neighbors you will trade with, neighbors you will have all type of intercourse and people relationships with and interactions with. And it's not the one-sided racist way that people like to talk about it. So I just wanted to present that. I wanted to kind of to share that with you. And there's more that goes into this in terms of her talking about the way in which she did this for God, and how she was proud to do this, and how the things that come out of her mouth come to pass. That when she speaks something, they come to pass. So this was considered to be a very great achievement for Hatshepsut. It was a great thing for her to be able to travel and send her entire expedition and parts of her army all the way to Punt, to go there successfully and to bring back God's land and to put it into the land of Kemet, and to bring back other resources that were coming from other places from the south of them. So I'd like to see what you think. Put your comments down below. I'd like to hear your commitment around this and some of your comments, if you will, and some of the additions that you can just contribute to this whole conversation, if you will. I thank you so much for joining me. Please share this with somebody, and I'll talk to you soon. I'll talk to you later. God bless you.